Okay, let's continue. So in all of the symmetric cryptography, symmetric encryption and authentication mechanisms we've talked about, these have all assumed that that the sender and receiver, the two communicating parties, already have a known shared key. Now, how did they get, how did they arrive at this state of conveniently having, a shared key that only the two of them who want to communicate know and nobody else in the whole world knows, right? That's kind of a big assumption. And of course, like we learned in World War I and II, it's possible to come up with processes, that, kind of more or less put that assumption in practice, by very carefully delivering a book worth of random numbers, before, setting up that way before the encryption and decryption and stuff like that. But most of the time, we do not want to do that. That's a really big problem. And especially if we have a large group of users, who might want to communicate with any of these other large group of users. There's billions of people in the world. Any of those billions of people might tomorrow want to text message, use WhatsApp or Signal or something to communicate with any of the other large, billions of users, right? And this creates an, billion times a billion, 7 billion times 7 billion n squared key sharing problem. If you want to be, set up keys to be ready to communicate with any of the other billions of people in the world, right? Kind of using pre-shared keys, that's, kind of laughably insane, right? So this is a huge problem, and this is what public key cryptography addresses. And this was one of the biggest advances in cryptography, basically in the last, probably the big revolution of cryptography in the last century, which makes it unnecessary for these large numbers of parties to have pre-shared secret keys. So the basic idea of public key cryptography is to separate the key into two parts, called the public part and the private part. And these are mathematically related in some way, typically using large number of arithmetic, and there's a lot of different variations on that. But the important thing is that the owner of the key pair keeps the private part of the key secret, so only that one person knows the private part, but then publishes the public part for anyone. So posts the public part on a bulletin board or in a newspaper, any way you find to broadcast to the world, okay, this public key is my key. Anybody who wants to encrypt something to me will use that public key to encrypt to me, or if I want to convince you that something comes from me, I'm going to use my private key and you'll verify it with my public key. And so we'll get into how that approach works. So but before we get into public key encryption and signing, let's look at the first building block, the first step in this, which was really the, at least the public in French, the unclassified, non-military defense world invention of asymmetric or public key crypto by Diffie and Hellman. So basically they invented Diffie-Hellman key agreement in this very landmark paper, which won a Turing Award not long ago. So Diffie-Hellman key exchange was published in 1976. The first major public key encryption and signing scheme, RSA, was published in 1977. But it turns out we later learned, we didn't know this at the time, but we later learned that the US and British, national intelligence agencies had actually invented this at least the idea several years before. Back in 1970, someone in GCHQ realized that this idea of public key was possible 6 years before it came out in the kind of the unclassified world. And then a few years later, people at GCHQ actually came up with methods that turned out to be similar to the methods of Diffie and Hellman. So, but of course, they didn't publish because spy agencies don't publish, at least not for us, right? And so the fact that this had happened, remained a secret for quite a while after, and as a result, Diffie and Hellman get all the credit for inventing public key cryptography, not James Ellis and Clifford Cox and so on, right? So anyway, so like I mentioned, public key cryptography assumes a public and private key. So two properties basically have to hold. In general, given the private key, it's easy to derive the public key. There's a clear algorithm to take the private key and produce the public key. Often the private key includes the public key. You just take a subset of the private key, a subset of the information in the private key, and that's the public key. But at any rate, that's an easy transformation. But if the scheme is secure, it had better be hard for anyone to go to take the public key and derive the private key. Otherwise, it'll be useless, right? So it's only a public key scheme of any kind, regardless of what it does, is only secure if it's cryptographically hard for anyone to take the private key and take the public key, which everybody knows, and figure out what the private key is, because that part should only be known and really cryptographically knowable to the person who generated the key pair, right? And so, so there are many ways to use many different types of public key crypto scheme. For encryption and decryption, we basically take anybody can use the public key to encrypt a message, and then the receiver of the message has to use the private key to decrypt. That ensures that only the holder of the private key can decrypt the message, even though anybody can encrypt using their public key, right? And then digital signatures basically are kind of the reverse of that, where only the holder of the private key can sign a message with the private key, but then once the message with the signature is broadcast to the world, anybody can use just the public key to check the signature to verify that, yeah, indeed, that message was signed with whoever holds the private key corresponding to that public key, right? And then finally, interactive key exchange, which Diffie-Hellman was basically created for, can create a shared private key over an insecure communication channel. So let's look at Diffie-Hellman, which is really kind of the foundation of this, like I mentioned. So the idea of Diffie-Hellman is we have two parties, call them Alice and Bob, or A and B. And they want to arrive at a shared secret that the two of them know, but nobody else knows. Now let's illustrate. A common way to illustrate this is let's just, embody a secret key as a secret paint color. A shade of paint that's going to be a mixture, and that's going to be the common secret. Now, how do they arrive at that common secret? Well, first of all, A and B start with just a common initial, some amount of, some standard paint color like yellow. Everybody knows kind of the initial paint color. But then Alice picks some amount of a secret shade that only Alice knows, and Bob picks, some amount of another secret shade of color that only Bob knows. And somehow, and then Alice sends a bucket of her shade to Bob. Bob sends a bucket of her shade to Alice using some transport that doesn't have to keep those shades secret. But let's assume that the truck carrying those paint colors can't be intercepted. Anybody can see the paint going over, but let's assume that nobody can actually intercept those. Right? And then, so Bob has created a bucket with a unit of his secret color. He takes Alice's the unit of secret color from Alice mixes in with his own to produce this kind of combined shade that depends on both Alice's and Bob's secret. Similarly, Alice, has initialized her bucket with a unit of her secret color, but then gets a unit of Bob's secret color in transport, mixes that in, and because once they're mixed well, it's the same amount of the same two secret colors. It should are the same two colors. It produces this common secret, and hopefully nobody else has that secret. Now, this is a loose analogy. In practice, if you see those secret colors, going in transit, you might be able to reverse engineer. This isn't isn't a perfect public key scheme, but it's an illustration of the general idea of what goes on. So, more specifically, we won't get into all the math, but just kind of the bare bones basic idea. What actually happens is, we're operating in an integer group or sometimes an elliptic curve increasingly. Alice picks so everybody agrees on a generator within this group that we can exponentiate. We can multiply it modulo a large prime number, for example, over and over. Alice picks a secret, random secret A, raises the generator to that secret to produce a public commit, which we often call big A, sends that to Bob. Similarly, Bob picks a random secret, sends, raises G to the B, sends that commit to Alice. And then Alice uses Bob's G to the B to further raise that to her secret A. Bob similarly takes Alice's commit G to the A, raises that to B, and because these exponents commute, they both produce G to the A times B. And so they both arrive at the same common secret, but because we believe the discrete logarithm problem is hard, so this Diffie-Hellman relies on the presumed hardness of the integer discrete logarithm problem in certain appropriately chosen groups. Anybody who sees the G to the A going across the wire, okay, well, they know G to the A, but they can't use that to get back to the A, which is what they would need to get this shared secret, right? So they both see the G to the A to the G to the B, but they can't find G to the AB without getting, both of the secrets, right? So that's the basic idea. Now, there's a lot of caveats and math that we don't need to get into, but that's kind of the most fundamental tool that allows us, so now you can have, a large number of parties, and as long as each party knows the other's public key, you can do this Diffie-Hellman agreement to find a secret key that only those two parties will know. And then you can use that common secret with all of the symmetric encryption and authentication algorithms we've been talking about to actually do secure communication. In principle, again, with a lot of caveats and potential traps to be careful of, right? And so TLS, the transport layer security, and many other protocols use Diffie-Hellman agreement. So let's look at some of the slightly higher level schemes and uses of public key cryptography. Like I mentioned, digital signatures allow the standard public key method for authentication. So it's the public key counterpart to MAX, basically. So a signer can use the private key to sign a message to produce a signature in such a way that any other party who just knows the public key, not the private key, can verify that the signer S actually wrote the message and that the message was not modified since the signer signed it, right? So very critical, important primitive. This is used in all kinds of ways. For example, for distributing software updates. Software vendors sign the binaries in the source code, various things with their keys, authenticated email, in various forms, public key certificates, digital certificates we'll get into later that for authenticating websites and stuff. All of these use public key signatures in various ways. Also, Bitcoin, for example, uses standard public key signatures to authorize a transaction. When you want to spend Bitcoin to pay somebody, you create a Bitcoin transaction whose main thing is, your authorization to spend this amount of Bitcoin is basically a signature using the private key associated with that Bitcoin wallet and the address you spend something to. When you send something, you are spending it on or sending it to a public key usually. So a public signing key. So I mentioned we can do Diffie-Hellman agreement in simple integer groups. That's traditionally worked reasonably well, but we've discovered that you have to use pretty big groups, like these days integer groups less than around 2048 bits tend to be considered not really secure anymore, because there's even though the discrete logarithmic problem in integer groups is still reasonably hard, there are it's not super hard. There are ways to accelerate it. Whereas if we use a different kind of group, for example, elliptic curves, which have slightly more complicated, very interesting mathematical properties. And I won't get into the details of elliptic curves here, but basically it's just a kind of a different group that we can do Diffie-Hellman and many of these other things in. We can get faster operations with smaller key sizes. We can get basically just use 256-bit keys rather than say 2048 for RSA or Diffie-Hellman. And so and there are increasingly popular curves like curve 25519 for this purpose. Yeah, and there are various digital signing algorithms. ECDSA from the US NIST is one of the common ones. There's also ones based on more recent curves. So let's skip that to in the interest of time. So that's basic key agreement and signing. So now this leaves an important problem, right? We kind of hypothesized in this ideal universe, anybody could create a key pair. I keep my private key to myself, but I publish my public key to everyone, right? And so if there was a mythical bulletin board in the sky that I could announce to the whole world, hey, this is my private key, my public key, put my picture next to it, hey, everybody, you know this, okay, now you know this is my public key, that's great, right? If that mythical bulletin board in the sky was infallible and, nobody but me could put my photo next to a public key, right? You see the problem? Yeah. Yeah, so, if the bulletin board is, if the bulletin board is allowing anybody to put anything on it, then, anybody else can put my photo and my name together with their public key and, trick other people into sending them, messages that only the attacker can decrypt and I can't, right? So how does anybody know, that what the bulletin board says is my public key really is my public key and not someone else's, right? And so this is actually a major, still unsolved problem in the use of crypto, of public key crypto in general. So public key crypto, kind of addressed the n by n, the n squared problem, but it reduced it to another hard problem, which is kind of how to authenticate the real ownership of these public keys in the first place. You know, given that all of these public keys are just random looking numbers, there's no reason, just looking at a public key, there's no reason to believe that's more likely my key than yours or something. They're just random strings, right? So this is what, you know, this is what inspired the problem of key distribution and public key infrastructure. And there's various ways to do this, but somehow we've got to, you know, distribute keys so that you know, so that anybody can figure out, you know, in a reasonably reliable, secure way, what is the public key for this particular person, right? And you know, what public key should I use to encrypt or to check signatures that they sent, right? And so the classic approach to doing this, which is common in TLS, the transport layer of security in many systems, is to use either key distribution centers or certificate authorities, so trusted authorities. And so, you know, a simplistic way of doing this is just assume, you know, there's one certificate authority in the world, and, you know, how many of you use PGP? Pretty good privacy. How many of you PGP users have put your public key on the MIT PGP key server? Okay, good, good. How many of you have put your PGP public key on any other PGP key server? Ah, good. I'm proud of you. There's a couple left. Yeah, yeah. So, you know, there are various PGP key servers, and these are the PGP version of, you know, a central, you know, authority that just records the databases of, you know, here's public keys that, you know, and they claim, you know, somebody claims to be that this public key is associated with this email address. We hope that's right, you know. And, you know, there are various ones of these authorities, but a lot of people just tend to, you know, the MIT PGP key server tends to be the most popular, and, you know, a lot of people just use that as the single reference point. But not everybody. So I'm glad to see some people are using multiple key servers anyway. But anyway, so we could just have a single central authority, but, you know, that tends to be a single point of failure or compromise, so that's not a really good thing. And so hierarchical, or, you know, somewhat more distributed public key infrastructure was designed to fill this, to address this problem. So in practice, if you look at the way that you know, kind of realistic key distribution systems like TLS or Kerberos work, basically you tend to have master key servers that manage, that, you know, for example, are responsible for broadcasting a list of the public keys for subdomains, for not for end users, but for other more specialized key servers that serve a subset of the population, right? And so then the more specialized key servers, for example, a key server specific to a particular country or a particular organization within the country, will then use will have a signing key, and it will use its authority delegated from the master key server to sign certificates saying, okay, for this particular user, you know, Alice is within this organization, Alice's public key is X and Bob's public key is Y, and stuff like that, right? So, and this is basically a way to deal with the scaling problem of, you know, how to assign you know, and distribute public keys to, you know, a large number of users across many countries and organizations, right? So basically, public key infrastructure, PKI, binds public keys with their owners and uses this kind of hierarchy, typically starting with root certificate authorities who sign certificates for, you know, subsidiary certificate authorities. And then, you know, there can be several levels of that, and then end user certificate authorities that, you know, you can get a certificate directly from, and typically people You typically you need to do this in order to run to use an SSL encrypted or TLS encrypted website to run a TLS encrypted website. It was originally supposed to be used to identify users as well, and it's possible to get end user certificates that authenticate you as a user to a website or to another party, but that turned out to be very clunky, so it's actually not used so often. Instead, we still just use passwords and stuff like that. So for authenticating users. So we have that. The PKI provides a way to distribute keys to users, but as we've seen, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. These certificate authorities are supposed to check the correspondence between the public key and the user. You're supposed to provide some evidence. Sometimes they get that wrong. But even worse, sometimes they get outright hacked. They get their private key stolen. They get confused into doing the wrong thing with their private key, and this has happened repeatedly. To different certificate authorities, and kind of these are huge problems because the compromise of a certificate authority basically affects the security of millions of users all at once potentially, and can potentially allow the attacker to basically impersonate anyone or any website in the world, right? And so that's a huge problem. There are partial solutions to it, but it's an ongoing issue. So that's classic certificate authorities. There's various kind of alternative models. I mentioned PGP. That traditionally uses a slightly different model called Web of Trust, where different users basically authenticate each other, preferably in person, based on who you know or meet at a conference. Some of us geeks, have done this kind of PGP key signing stuff, but most ordinary users tend to not find it very usable. And there's various research ideas to improve that. For example, simple public key infrastructure, or spooky, as it's called, was an interesting proposal for a while back. It's mostly an experiment. Never really got into widespread use, and then more recently there are systems like Connix providing different approaches to public key distribution and transparency. Okay. So key distribution is still an unsolved problem, but those are some of the tools that we use regularly to at least partly solve it. So finally, let's look briefly at end-to-end encryption. So we ultimately typically want like a user Alice to be able to encrypt a message to some other user Bob, and ensure that nobody in the middle can decrypt it. At least to some degree, this is what protocols like TLS were originally designed for. Now, in practice, TLS tends to be used only to encrypt between a user and a web server. So the web server is the other endpoint in this case, and whether that's really end-to-end depends on your application. So in the context of TLS, which is a very widespread protocol, we're basically encrypting the communication between a user and an endpoint, a network endpoint, which is typically a server, web server, VoIP, email service, or something like that. And it's gone through many iterations. It runs a handshake protocol. Often that handshake protocol uses Diffie-Hellman, like we described earlier. We won't get into the details, but it has to use this public key cryptography to exchange a shared secret that's just used in that TLS session. So that's the most important aspect of that. Now, TLS has gone through pain. Some versions of TLS were discovered to have weaknesses. We won't get into the issues, into the specific vulnerabilities, but they're deep and interesting. And but you know, regardless, it's iterated. You know, the latest versions of TLS are you know, reasonably solid and reasonably secure for what they do, but they still have limitations as well. And you know, and what we know as HTTPS, or you know, secure HTTP, is just HTTP, the web protocol using TLS. And so, you know, tons of stuff that we do every day. You know, anything that goes over HTTPS is using that all the time. Okay, so yeah, and we'll explore some of the attacks and defenses that apply to this as we continue in the semester. Okay, thank you, and see you next week.